My name is Alex Shu. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion. And I just want to thank you for tuning in today to watch us begin our series that we are thinking about titling Engaged, where we speak with practitioners and scholars of religion around the world um, in our capacity as an Institute for the Global Engagement with Religion. We are a relatively new institute at the Kia School of Global Affairs here at Notre Dame, and we're interested in promoting the study of religion or religions around the world, and especially how they engage with non-religious actors and other religions in a global affairs framework. So what this means is we are curious about religious dialogues of all kinds, right? How religions talk to each other, how faith leaders and adherents speak with one another, and how faith is talked about or invoked in the popular press or on the political stage. And it also means we are keen to see how religions or the religious intersect with pressing issues of the day, questions of economic development or injustice or social provision, migration, war, technology, disasters like climate change or the COVID-19 pandemic we all find ourselves in presently. To that end, I am pleased to be speaking with Mr. Charlie Pine today on Good Friday in 2020. Mr. Pine is a fellow at the Inspired Leadership Initiative here at the University of Notre Dame. Charlie, how about I let you introduce yourself, the ILI, and how this idea for recording our conversation all came together.
That's great. Good morning, Alex. It's good to be together. I do find myself here at the University of Notre Dame for the 2019-2020 academic year as a fellow, as you said, in the Inspired Leadership Initiative. I often find myself introducing my presence here at Notre Dame as following in the footsteps of my two oldest sons, who have both been students and both recent graduates of the University of Notre Dame. About a year and a half ago, our second son was the one who first told me about the Inspired Leadership Initiative and explained to me that there was a new program being launched at the university for people. I added this phrase in second half of life, but my son said, it's a program for people going through life transitions, Dad. Maybe you should look into it. And our family, after having spent over 20 years living in China, relocated back to the US 5 years ago, and the rest of our family who was not here at Notre Dame were in Colorado for the previous 4 years. And my son said, Dad, maybe as you are continuing to ask the question of what's next in your journey, maybe this year-long program that was designed as an opportunity for discernment focused on this very question of what might be the focus of the next season of life. My son encouraged me to explore it, and I applied and was graciously accepted to join the second cohort of that program here at Notre Dame, also a new program. And so the rest of our family moved here to South Bend last summer and are coming near the end of this academic year experience.
That's fantastic. So how did you find us, the Ansari Institute for Global Engagement with Religion? What does global engagement with religion mean to you? How did you first begin to seriously engage your own religious tradition and then other religious traditions after that?
Yeah, so interestingly, I actually knew of the Ansari Institute before I knew of the Inspired Leadership Initiative, and similar sources of information being our two oldest sons who were here at Notre Dame and both very involved with international global issues. Our oldest son double majored at Notre Dame in Arabic and peace studies, and our second son did political science and Chinese before joining the Kia School's newly formed master's program in global affairs. So as Ansari was formed in the Kyo school, both of our sons were very familiar with the news surrounding that and shared that with me. And so I've been watching the development of the Ansari Institute since the gift that created the Institute was first made, and then through the formative, these last few years of really having the program become established. And so when I knew I was given this opportunity to come to the university for the academic year as a fellow in the ILI program, again, before that program began, I had had the opportunity to meet Mahan Mirza, the executive director of the Ansari Institute. And so we had actually begun our own personal engagement prior to my moving here for the program. And so that just continued once we were in residence. And so he and I actually last fall began a discussion amongst the two of us about the possibility of Ansari sponsoring a talk that I might give, sharing some of our family's experiences in China. And one of the phrases that I've used over time to describe our journey is a 25-year journey from missionary to peacemaker. And while I never fully identified in an exact role as missionary, it was certainly a key part of what motivated me as a young college graduate nearly 30 years ago to head off to China and really want to see my life as an impact on other communities around the world. And so this idea of global engagement, and then over the years in China, some of the interaction with religion combined in with that. But yeah, when Ansari was first created, it really captivated me as something that kind of shined a spotlight on what I've been giving my life to over the last few decades.
Mission is absolutely one of the first keywords thinking about the Christian tradition for Christian engagement with the world, right? How do we make more of this? How do we spread the good news? What was your sort of engagement with Christianity growing up? And you said that that changed after college. How did that change, and how did you decide to become, if not exactly a missionary, to be a fellow traveler on a mission, so to speak?
Yeah. So I was actually thinking about this discussion and some of the preparatory work we've done, and thinking about this phrase, global engagement with religion. And my adult children are really intrigued when I tell them about my upbringing, the part of life before they were in the picture. The only father they have known and experienced is a dad who has been globally engaged with religions their whole life.
Yeah.
But it was really not at all on my radar growing up. I did not have any inkling of thinking about living globally, engaging globally. I grew up, as I tell my Chinese friends, at about the exact center of the geographic United States. So I grew up in Independence, Missouri, and had minimal, extremely minimal interactions with people from other countries, other traditions. Some ways I would say I was almost a poster child for monoculturalism growing up. I had no interest in studying another language. And so really for me, the first deep engagement was with kind of the transformation of beginning to engage my own tradition. So I grew up very much identifying myself as a Christian. I was born into a Christian family, broader community, grew up going to church on Sundays. But it was really not until late high school that a very close friend of mine in high school asked me one day, "Charlie, are you a Christian?" And I thought it was a bit of a strange question and said, "Well, yeah, of course." And this friend of mine probed a little deeper in asking, "Well, what do you think that actually means?" And I found I was very, very ill-equipped to give any kind of a coherent answer. to what identifying as a Christian even meant to me. It seemed a very simplistic, well, that's just who I am. And this friend began to probe, don't you find it a bit strange that you would carry this identity but not really have a sense of what it means? And after being slightly offended at the questioning I was subjected to, I concluded actually it was a very reasonable set of questions. And that really marked, I would say, a beginning of a personal journey where I wanted to really ask the question, what does this mean to identify with a particular religious tradition, a community? I'd never seriously read any of the Bible, kind of the central religious text of Christianity. I was familiar with stories having grown up, but certainly very limited personal engagement. And so really during my 4 years of university, that became this hugely transforming experience of both personal, deep engagement with study of the scriptures, intentional engagement with a community of people who wanted this to be central in their lives. And it was out of that that really my personal engagement with this particular tradition kind of opened my eyes to global questions, issues. And yeah, one story in particular that I would say was really monumental in that development during my university years was encountering the story of the prophet Jonah. It's recorded in the Old Testament Hebrew prophets. And so there's this short text that's actually named after the prophet. And many people will be familiar with that story of God asking Jonah to go to the city of Nineveh, and his initial reluctance and a little bit of a detour through the belly of a fish, and finally him finding himself in the city of Nineveh delivering this message of pending judgment from God. And the people repent, they change in light of his message, and God therefore shows them mercy. But this entire account ends with this dialogue between Jonah and God. And Jonah becomes very upset that God has actually shown mercy to a community that he felt was undeserving of God's mercy. And anyhow, to come to the very end, God has the last word in this scriptural text of the recording of the story of Jonah. And he ends by making this statement to the prophet. And he says to him, the city of Nineveh has more than 120,000 people who cannot tell their right hand from their left, and many cattle as well. And then he ends by posing a question to Jonah, and he says, should I not be concerned about that great city? And I think as a young college student, 20 years of age, as I began to encounter that story, that question became very personal to me, and asking myself, well, what is it that I'm concerned about? God's challenging Jonah, are you not concerned about this city with more than 120,000 people in it? And God really began to just open my heart, my mind. And at that time, academically, I was studying more about the country of China. And I think God somehow in my story began to transform this Jonah text and make it very personal to me. And I thought, if God was concerned about 120,000 people in Nineveh, what about the more than 1 billion people living in the country of China? And maybe he's asking me, Charlie, are you concerned about these people? And that really became very foundational in launching me into a question of, well, how do you express concern for people? And in my younger years, that was very much mixed with, well, my religious faith means my concern would be, how do I share that faith that was emerging in my own life with other people, that it might bless them in the ways that it had blessed me.
Okay, that's very interesting. Thanks for sharing that very personal story with us. So young Charlie Pine, age 20, decides to head out to China to share God's message with them. What did young Charlie Pine think that message was, and how did that message change over 20 or 25 years? Or maybe you could just tell us about the first year, or one story from the first year. What was it like when you landed?
Yeah, that is, it's great to reflect back on the story. I think for me, even as I just shared a little bit of my years leading up to launching off to China, I think the thing that I found honestly very shocking when I arrived in China was just the depth in which people I encountered there looked at me and said, "What do you mean when you talk about God? We don't think there is such a thing as God." And I found myself very ill-equipped, ill-prepared to navigate what do you do with that? I have all these thoughts of I want to tell you about God and this and that, but this foundational, just the simple mention of the word God and encountering, for me, it was just shocking to come face to face with atheism and a culture, a people who were largely steeped through modern education in China that the material world is all there is. Humans will dictate their own paths in that. There is no supernatural being. And so my early years, I found myself just really struggling with, okay, I want to bring a message, and yet I just don't even know where to start. In the New Testament writings, the gentleman by the name of Paul, one of the early followers of Jesus, his writings, obviously, for those who know something of this, feature very prominently in the New Testament writings. Both his story is recorded in the book of Acts, and then a number of letters that he wrote to different communities that he'd engaged with form much of the holy writings in the New Testament. And in one of his letters, when he wrote to the community in the city of Corinth, he speaks of some of his journey of engaging different communities, and he used language that was very impactful for me as a young man when he spoke about engaging different types of religious or non-religious communities. And he summarized the ways in which he attempted to connect with those different types of communities by saying, "I became all things to all men." And then he actually adds the reason for that. So it was this incredibly adaptive person, taking on different customs, trying to adjust to other people's ways of being. And so he says, "I became all things to all men so that by all possible means I might save some." So this idea of salvation was very central, and that was very impactful for me as a young man. I really began to ask myself, how would I begin to apply this to the Chinese? To say to the Chinese, I became like the Chinese. And it was very instrumental in my commitment to learning the language and culture that I invested heavily on the front end, years trying to learn how to communicate effectively in Mandarin Chinese, understanding something of the culture. But this religious piece still really stumped me. And I found myself, in fact, I remember in those early years asking myself, to the atheist, I became like an atheist. I thought, that makes no sense. To the God deniers, I became like a God denier so that I could tell them about God. And I thought, this is just nonsense. And I think it really reached a breakthrough moment for me when I started to lean in more heavily to this phrase, to the non-religious, I became non-religious. And that became, I think, an initial clue that maybe here is a connect point where I can learn something of cultural adaptation, recognizing that maybe the religious piece as a system maybe that's not so critical to the message that God's given me to share with people. And so maybe here's a way that I might adapt and learn from this community. And it really became very central. So I later went on in my educational journey to do a master's degree in Chinese language and culture, and began to grapple very deeply with the Confucian tradition. And it was very instrumental in my later years in China.
Let's step back a little bit. That's all very fascinating. Um, how does a mission think? How does a missionary think? Right? How do you isolate which populations to save first, and what does salvation look like? Um, this is a form of engagement that I've done a little bit of reading on, but it's nice to hear it from the horse's mouth, so to speak, if you're willing to say a
I
little
would
more.
love to, yes. And yeah, I think I can speak to both kind of the earlier expressions, understanding of that. And as we go on in our discussion, I'm sure we will touch on how that's been transformed and changed. But yeah, I think at the core of religious mission, and so for me as a Christian wanting to share that message, my later years, I've experienced this in other religious traditions, this missionary zeal approach. But yeah, I think at the core, there is the sense that God's salvation message is contained within a particular tradition where someone has encountered what they see as religious truth. And therefore, there's this assumption that for others to participate in being in a right relationship with God, being saved, having the promise of life after death, so many different expressions of what that might mean, is very tightly connected with belonging to the right religious group. So for most Christians, they would view the world in a fairly simplistic view, I suspect. And this was certainly true of my early years, that the world could be fairly simply divided into two categories, Christian and non-Christian. And so the nuances of whether you're Muslim, Buddhist, atheist, or whatever, those could actually be somewhat glossed over and collectively put in this non-Christian circle, which was to say, these are the ones that need this message of salvation. And there's actually some really fascinating research that's been done over decades in the Christian mission world about unreached people groups, and research that's been done on how do we target communities that have limited access to the Christian message. And so there's all kinds of anthropological, ethnographic research compiled around which communities in the world have identify with which religions. And having gone to Asia, that was hugely instrumental for me to live in a part of the world that's home to most of the non-Christian religions, and to see that part of the world and engage with that part of the world, and really to be challenged by the assumptions I bring, what do they look like lived out in this context?
We've talked a little bit before about your engagement with various Islamic communities in China. Could you speak a little bit about the Islamic communities that you've engaged with, and what that was like? How you thought they needed saving of some kind, or needed God's message from a Christian standpoint, and how that might have evolved over
Yeah.
your time.
So I tell people when I first moved to China 28 years ago now, all of my experiences were on the East Coast, which China only has one coastal region. It's landlocked on basically 3 of the 4 directions. It's just along the East Coast. About 20% of the land is home to 80% of China's population in those coastal regions. And again, my earlier comments about this non-religious, atheistic society captured the majority of people I encountered in China's mega cities on the East Coast. But in my first years, I actually had opportunities to travel into Western China, and really it was my first exposure to ethnic minority groups, which actually originally included Tibetan communities, which are followers of Tibetan Buddhism, and then also encountering Muslim communities in the northwest regions of the country. And as a young man, I was undone by, again, my limited understanding. I didn't even know that such communities existed in China before I went there. And so I was intrigued by where do these people, these communities fit within China. But as a young man, I began this journey. I was deeply impacted, again, back to the holy writings, all the way back to the initial book of the Hebrew scriptures, the book of Genesis. It tells the story of Abraham, this man who is of central importance to both the Jewish, Christian, and Muslim religions. And they're often referred to as the Abrahamic religions. And in the account of Abraham's story, there's this fascinating promise that God makes to Abraham, which we would say was some 4,000 years ago, in which God speaks to Abraham and he says, Abraham, through you, I will bless all the nations on earth. And so when I was about 23 years old, as I began to encounter some of these ethnic groups of China, including Muslim groups that you referenced, I started praying over a map of China. And I had identified geographically where all of the officially recognized ethnic groups were centrally located. And I started praying. I was a 23-year-old who thought he probably knew everything about life at that point. But my prayer was rather simple, and it was simply, God, you promised to bless all nations on earth. And so I just asked. I asked that you'd bless these peoples in northeast China and across north central China and northwest, southwest. And so I would take about 10 days and pray over the entire country, just asking, God, would you bless these peoples? And I'm sure at that time, blessing in many ways probably meant to me help them in some way or fashion to become Christian. Maybe that was the key to their receiving God's blessing. But I don't know how precisely I would have articulated it as such, but looking back, I suspect that was not far off the mark of praying for blessing. And how did I understand that? But anyhow, in that process of praying over the entire country, the language I used then and continue to use today is I sensed God really drawing my heart to this, what I call central Western region. Of particular concern, there were 4 of China has 10 ethnic minority groups that are Muslim majority. And 6 of them are primarily located in the far northwest corner of the country, and 4 are in this more central Western region. And so I became very intrigued. I thought my wife and I would move there early in our marriage to work in these communities. That did not transpire until some 14 years later. And so it was just our last 5 years in China. We finally moved from the East Coast, took our 3 children at the time, and moved out to central Western China to begin ethnographic research on these Muslim ethnic groups. And by the time we finally made that move, I often tell my Muslim friends, it's a good thing I didn't come 14 years earlier. I suspect our relationships would not have developed as nicely as they did later. The assumptions, again, I alluded to earlier, I think would have created much more tensions. And so a vision over those years for dialogue and mutual learning had emerged. And therefore that shaped in a very different direction what our years among those Muslim communities looked like.
So now we've reviewed a whole career, a trajectory. 20-year-old Charlie is now, I don't know, 35 years in our reckoning, but we do have to wrap up soon. So was there a transformation moment for you? You keep alluding, right, to something changing in your mind. I used to think like this. So when did you come to think about things in the way that you think about them now, or is that always a changing process, an evolving process?
Yeah, so definitely I would say it's a ongoing process, but there are definitely some clear road marks, stakes in the ground that have really shifted things for me. I think I was just incredibly blessed in my years in China to have different men and women, people come along as mentors who really shaped, sharpened my thinking, pressed me to grapple with deeper questions of God's purposes globally. I spoke of this promise to Abraham, blessing all nations. I think probably the one piece that I could try to give some voice to here and articulate, there's a story recorded in the gospel accounts of the life of Jesus, and there's a dialogue that's recorded by one of his closest followers by the name of John. And it tells the story of an encounter between this Jewish religious leader by the name of Nicodemus and Jesus. And the account says that Nicodemus came at night to see Jesus, and he began addressing him as rabbi or as teacher. And he said, "Rabbi, we know that you are a man who has come from God, for no one could do the miraculous signs that we see you doing unless God were with him." And so this very respectful, in my later years, I've been intrigued by what Nicodemus said in reference to Jesus captures so beautifully what many of my Muslim friends, I believe, would say in regard to Jesus as well. But Jesus, for me, seemingly almost coming out of left field, responds to Nicodemus and he says, "I tell you the truth, unless a man is born again, he will never see the kingdom of God." And there's two things in that expression that I think really became foundational for my transformation. One was this concept of the kingdom of God. And even having deeply engaged with my own tradition and the scriptures, I would have to say that it was in my years in China that I began to realize I really am not sure what this is talking about. I see it in the scriptures, but I've heard very little teaching about it. And what is that exactly? Jesus seems to talk all about it, but I'm not quite sure that I have a firm grip on what this is. And then I think back to the story with Nicodemus, this phrase, and I've certainly had heard it in Christian circles, born again, which many Christians would put as a clarifying label to the word Christian. But I became hugely intrigued, and again, people who led me into this journey of language that began to formulate for me around first birth and second birth. And I think I began to have a new paradigm for understanding that our religious identities, rather than being central to whether we're blessed or not by God, I began to see them more through the lens of these are part of our first birth identities that he's determined for all of us. I tell friends, I later came to realize God didn't ask me if I wanted to be born in America or China, what color skin I wished to have, what language I wanted to be first exposed to. And so this whole idea of first birth identities and beginning to see religion rooted out of that. And it gave me this new paradigm for actually approaching religious differences from a much deeper, more profound sense of respect and honoring that this is something which God has determined for each of us. And then he has these common purposes from that that he would like for us to seek. And so it radically changed my view of I need to help people shift their religious identity to I need to operate with people in whatever religious identities they find themselves in, and then from there begin to explore what are the spiritual realities that we are all being called to seek after from whatever different starting points we find ourselves in. So that I'm sure raises many, many more questions, but hopefully it gives some framework of how some things shifted for me in my journey.
On the one hand, that is a beautiful starting point, right? A starting point for dialogue and exploration and a new chapter in faith. On the other hand, it has to be an ending point for us because our recording session time has come to an end and we'll have to pick this up again soon.
Look forward to it.
So thank you, Charlie, for joining us today. I want to encourage listeners and viewers to email us at ansari@nd.edu or to follow us at ansariund at Twitter. If you have any questions, if you have any comments, we'd love to hear from you. I'd love to do another session with Charlie and other dialogue partners. But we want you to be part of the conversation together. We are all about dialogue.